She was 66 years old and, in the eyes of the town, destitute. Her husband, Arthur, had passed with the last of the summer roses, leaving her with a name, a small frame house, and an orchard everyone called a failure. She had no children, no savings to speak of, and a notice from the bank folded on her kitchen table. And with the little dignity she had left, she prepared to walk away from the 40 acres of gnarled, unproductive apple trees. But what no one knew, what Arthur himself had almost forgotten, was that buried between the 9th and 10th rows of Newtown pippins was a secret that would not only save the land but reclaim her life. Settle in and listen close. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Mabel had been born a carpenter's daughter in a green Ohio valley, and the scent of sawdust was her first and most comforting memory. Her father, Thomas, was a man of few words and gifted hands. He did not build grand things, but he built true things. Chairs that did not wobble, doors that hung square in their jambs, and cabinets whose drawers slid shut with a soft, satisfying whisper. He taught her the names of the woods by their grain and their smell, the spicy sharpness of cedar, the heavy sweetness of walnut, the clean humility of pine. He taught her that a tool was an extension of the hand, and that patience was the most important tool of all. When she was 10, he had spent a winter's worth of evenings whittling her a gift from a scrap of cherry wood. It was a small wren, no bigger than her thumb, its head cocked as if listening for a song. Its perfection was not in its detail, but in its balance. It felt alive in her palm, a small, solid piece of her father's quiet love, and she had kept it in her apron pocket for 56 years. She met Arthur Dunn when she was 20. He was nothing like her father. Where Thomas was quiet earth, Arthur was brilliant sky. He was full of plans and poetry, his hands better suited to gesturing at a distant horizon than holding a hammer. He spoke of a future in the West, in the Oregon country, where the soil was black and deep, and a man could plant a dream and watch it grow. He saw her, truly saw her, in a way no one else had. He saw the steady competence beneath her shyness and called it strength. He loved her, and so she packed the little wooden wren, said goodbye to the Ohio Valley, and followed his dream across the continent. They settled in a small, fertile pocket of the Willamette Valley, and Arthur bought 40 acres with money borrowed against the promise of the land itself. He would plant the finest apples in the state. Their fortune would grow from the branches. Mabel built the shelves in their pantry and mended the fences, her hands remembering the lessons of her father. She planted a kitchen garden that thrived, its orderly rows of beans and squash a stark contrast to Arthur's grand, chaotic vision. He was a good man and a kind husband, but he was a dreamer, not a farmer. He loved the idea of the orchard more than the daily grueling work of it. He read books on pomology, but was inconsistent with the pruning shears. He would spend a week grafting new varietals with feverish excitement, only to neglect the irrigation ditches for the entire month of August. The trees grew, but they did not flourish. The crops were meager, the apples often small and blighted. Townspeople called it Dunn's folly. Arthur's optimism, however, never failed. "Next year, my love," he would say, his eyes shining. "Next year will be our year." He was always looking toward the next season, the next crop, the next horizon, and Mabel loved him for it. Even as she canned the few good apples they managed to harvest, her pragmatism a quiet anchor to his soaring hope. She knew he was secretive about money, ashamed of their lean circumstances, and she never pressed him. She simply made do. And so they lived for 46 years, in a state of gentle, loving failure. When he died, the orchard was more tangled and overgrown than ever, and Mabel was left alone with the silence, the gnarled trees, and the weight of his beautiful, unrealized dream. The knock on the door came a month after the funeral, on a Tuesday morning gray, with the threat of rain. It was Mr. Silas Croft, the president of the Merchants' Bank of Lafayette. He was a man whose body seemed to have been formed by his profession. Narrow, upright, and pale like a column of figures. He removed his hat, his movements precise and without warmth, and stepped into her kitchen. He did not accept her offer of coffee. He preferred to stand. Mabel remained seated at the small table her father had helped her build as a wedding gift, its surface scarred with the history of their life together. Her hands rested in her lap, still. Mr. Croft cleared his throat, a dry, papery sound. He spoke of his deep respect for Arthur, of his own personal sadness at his passing. His words were smooth and practiced, stones worn down in a river of false sentiment. Mabel listened without expression. She had heard similar words for weeks, and she knew their hollowness. Finally, he came to the point of his visit. He placed a leather portfolio on the table, and from it produced a sheaf of documents. "Mabel," he said, using her first name with a familiarity he had not earned, "I am afraid there is some difficult business to attend to. It concerns a rather substantial loan Arthur took out against the property some years ago." He pushed the papers across the table. A foreclosure notice, a summary of debt, the numbers stark and brutal. "It seems," Mr. Croft continued, his voice softening into a tone of theatrical pity, "that no payments were ever made. The interest has accumulated." Mabel looked at the papers. The amount was staggering. More than the land could ever be worth, especially in its current state. She felt a cold stillness spread through her chest, but her face remained a quiet mask. She did not believe him, not fully. Arthur had been a poor manager, but he was an honest man. Yet she had no proof, no ledger books, no defense. She had only a feeling, and a feeling was not a currency the bank recognized. "I have a proposal," Mr. Croft said, leaning forward slightly, a predator disguised as a savior. "To spare you the public embarrassment of a foreclosure auction, the bank is prepared to assume ownership of the land. We will forgive the entirety of the outstanding debt. A clean slate." He smiled, a brief, thin gesture. "And of course, you would be welcome to remain in the house through the winter, as our guest. It is the least we can do for Arthur's widow." The cruelty of it was in its pretense of kindness. He was not just taking her land. He was offering her charity in her own home. He was casting her out with a gentle administrative push. Mabel looked from his pale, expectant face to the documents on the table. She did not argue. She did not plead. She did not weep. To do so would be to give him a satisfaction he did not deserve. Her father had taught her that the truest strength was in quiet endurance. She gave a single, slow nod. "I see," she said, her voice even. It was all she would give him. Satisfied, Mr. Croft gathered his hat. "The papers just require your signature. Take a day to look them over. I will send a clerk by tomorrow afternoon." He let himself out, closing the door softly behind him, leaving the documents lying on the table like a death sentence. Mabel sat in the silence, the scent of rain and damp earth drifting in through the window. She did not touch the papers. She simply sat, her hand in her apron pocket, her fingers wrapped around the smooth, cool wood of a small, carved bird. She did not sign the papers. When the clerk arrived the next day, she met him at the door and told him, simply, "I need more time." The young man, flustered, retreated. She knew it was only a temporary reprieve, a week, perhaps two, before Croft would proceed without her consent. The time was not for fighting, for she had no weapons. It was for saying goodbye. She pulled on Arthur's old canvas jacket, the sleeves too long, the shoulders too broad, and walked out into the orchard. It was not a journey of miles, but of memory and sensation. She walked away from the house, away from the identity of Mrs. Arthur Dunn, and into the wild heart of her husband's failure, which was now solely hers. The air was cool and heavy, carrying the wine-sweet scent of fallen apples fermenting on the ground. A low mist clung to the lower branches of the trees, and the sky was the color of slate. Her boots sank into the soft, damp soil, a mixture of black earth and decaying leaves. She began at the first row. The Baldwins, their branches reaching out like desperate bony arms, thick with water sprouts and tangled with bindweed. The bark was scaly, patterned with lichen, green and gray. She ran her hand over it, feeling the rough, living texture. Arthur had been so proud of these. The finest pineapple in all of America, he'd declared, the day he'd planted the saplings. Now, the few apples that remained on the limbs were small, pocked with scab, food for the jays and the worms. She walked on, row by row, her path a slow, methodical grid. She saw the orchard not with a farmer's eye toward profit, nor with a banker's eye toward liability, but with the observant patience her father had taught her. She saw the clogged irrigation ditch, a line of stagnant water and choked cattails. She saw where a winter storm had brought down a section of the deer fence, allowing them free passage to nibble at the low-hanging growth. She saw the suckers growing thick and wild from the base of the rootstocks, diverting energy from the fruit-bearing limbs above. It was a litany of neglect, a testament to a dream untended. And yet, as she walked, something else began to emerge from beneath the ruin. She saw the strong, straight trunks of the trees, their foundations solid. She saw the elegant architecture of the main branches, the structure Arthur had intended, obscured but not yet lost. She saw the rich, dark soil that Arthur had been so right about, soil that could grow anything if given a chance. She reached the back of the property, where the land rose in a gentle slope. Here, Arthur had planted the Newtown pippins, his prized varietal. They were the oldest trees planted in their first year. They were larger, their forms more gnarled and ancient. Standing there, looking back toward the small, distant shape of her house, she did not feel despair. The grief for her husband was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of things, but the feeling that settled over her now was different. It was a quiet, profound sorrow, not for herself but for the trees. They had been planted with such hope, and they had been so terribly let down. She felt a strange kinship with them. They were survivors, just as she was. The journey ended there at the last row of pippins, with the cool metal of the foreclosure. Notice a distant thought and the immediate, physical reality of the land beneath her feet, the only thing that mattered. She had acquired it all, not through a will or a grand inheritance, but by default. The 40 acres, the 2,000 trees, the crushing debt, the public failure. It was all Mabel's now. She stood in the center of it, a queen of a ragged kingdom. For the next 2 days, she did nothing but walk and look. She learned the orchard's topography, the way the morning sun hit the eastern slope, the low-lying area that held the damp longest after a rain. She learned to distinguish the trees not just by row, but as individuals, each with its own particular twist of limb, its own pattern of moss and lichen. The orchard was a mess, but it was a structured mess. Arthur, for all his lack of follow-through, had laid it out with precision. The rows were perfectly straight, spaced 20 feet apart. The trees within the rows were planted at the same interval, creating a perfect grid that was now distorted by years of untamed growth. The packing shed, a small, unpainted board and batten structure at the edge of the property, was her first project. The door hung from one hinge. Inside, it smelled of dust, dried apple cores, and mice. Old wooden picking crates were stacked haphazardly in one corner, several of them broken. A long sorting table stood in the center of the room, its surface covered in a thick layer of grime. On the wall hung the ghosts of tools, a pruning saw, a pair of long-handled loppers, and a rusty scythe. Everything was broken or in disrepair. The saw's teeth were dull, the loppers seized with rust, the scythe's blade nicked and pitted. It was a place of abandonment. Mabel spent an entire afternoon there, not working, but simply taking stock. She ran her hand over the rough wood of the sorting table. She picked up a broken crate and examined the joinery. It was simple, mass-produced work, nothing like her father's careful craftsmanship. The trees themselves were the greatest challenge. They were overgrown, a tangle of crossing branches and unproductive vertical shoots. A proper pruning would take weeks, and it was work that required a strong back and a steady hand on a ladder. She was 66, and while she was spry, she knew her own limits. The irrigation system was a disaster. The main ditch that fed water from the creek at the north end of the property was choked with silt and weeds. The smaller channels that ran between the rows were invisible, buried under a mat of grass and fallen leaves. Without water, the trees would never produce healthy fruit. But beneath the decay, she saw what could be salvaged. The rootstock, the very foundation of the orchard, was a hardy, disease-resistant variety Arthur had insisted on. The trees, for all their neglect, were not dead. They were dormant, waiting. There was a strange, wild beauty to the place, the kind of beauty that comes from nature, reclaiming a human endeavor. The way the wild clematis vine had woven itself through the branches of a Baldwin tree, its fluffy seed heads like bursts of smoke, was, in its own way, lovely. Mabel did not see a financial liability. She saw a lifetime of work, and in the face of losing everything, the prospect of hard, meaningful labor felt less like a burden and more like a reason to get up in the morning. She decided she would start with what she could manage, clearing the weeds from the base of a single tree. It was a small, achievable act in the face of an overwhelming whole. She would begin with the oldest tree on the property, the first Newtown pippin Arthur had planted, the one he'd called Adam. On the third day, she went to the old packing shed and found a spading fork. The handle was sun-bleached and splintered, but the tines were forged steel, coated in a layer of dry mud and rust. She spent an hour with a whetstone and a rag soaked in oil, cleaning and sharpening a small hand trowel, and then another hour cleaning the fork. The rhythmic scrape of stone on metal was a familiar, soothing sound, a memory from her father's workshop. With her tools prepared, she walked to the far end of the orchard, to the old pippin tree Arthur had named Adam. It stood on a slight rise, its trunk thick and gnarled like an old man's fist. A thicket of thorny blackberry vines and waist-high thistle had grown up around its base, a protective, hostile color. She began her work patiently. She used the sharpened trowel to cut through the tough roots of the thistles, pulling them up one by one and laying them in a pile. The work was slow and methodical. Her back began to ache, a dull throb in her lower spine. But she ignored it, focusing on the task, on the feel of the cool earth in her hands. After an hour, she had cleared a circle about 3 feet wide around the trunk. The soil was dark and rich, tangled with a fine mesh of grass roots. She took up the spading fork, pressing her booted foot onto its shoulder and driving the tines into the earth. She meant only to loosen the compacted soil, to allow air and water to reach the tree's roots. She worked her way around the trunk, turning over shovelfuls of dirt. On her fourth pass on the north side of the tree, the fork stopped short with a dull, heavy thud. It was not the sharp crack of hitting a stone. It was a dead, metallic sound. She tried again a few inches over, and again the same resonant thud. Curiosity piqued. She set the fork aside and knelt on the damp ground. She dug with her hands, her fingers scraping through the cool, crumbly soil. About 6 inches down, her fingertips brushed against something cold and hard. It was flat and it was metal. She scraped away more earth, revealing a dark, rusted iron surface. It was the top of a box, an old strong box about the size of a loaf of bread, its surface pitted and scaled with orange rust. It was heavy. She had to dig all around it, rocking it back and forth, before she could pry it from the grip of the earth. She dragged it out onto the cleared ground. There was a heavy iron handle on the top and a large, ornate lock on the front, its mechanism completely seized with rust. There was no keyhole visible. She tried to lift it, grunting with the effort. It was far heavier than an empty box had any right to be. She sat back on her heels, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. She thought of Arthur, of his secrets and his silences. She had to get it open. Using the sharp point of her trowel, she scraped at the seam where the lid met the box, but the seal was tight. She needed leverage. She walked back to the shed, her mind racing, and returned with a small crowbar she'd seen lying in a corner. She wedged the tip into the seam and put her weight on it. The metal groaned in protest. She pushed harder, and with a loud, wrenching screech, the rusted hinge gave way. The lid popped open an inch. She lifted it the rest of the way. The inside was lined with oilcloth, and resting on the cloth, stacked in neat, tight rows, were gold coins, double eagles gleaming with a soft, buttery light in the gray afternoon. It was not a pirate's hoard, but something far more precious, a lifetime of careful hidden savings. Beneath the coins, wrapped in another layer of oilcloth, was a thin packet of papers. Her hands trembled as she lifted it out. She unwrapped it carefully. The top document was the deed to the property, in Arthur's name, free and clear. Beneath it was a folded paper, a receipt from the First Bank of Portland, not Lafayette. And at the bottom of the receipt, in crisp, official letters, was a stamp. Paid in full. It was dated 5 years ago. It was for the very loan Mr. Croft had cited, and tucked within the paid receipt was a letter, folded twice. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, the handwriting was unmistakably Arthur's. The world seemed to fall silent around her. The chill of the autumn air, the scent of the damp earth, the ache in her back, it all receded. There was only the box, the impossible glint of gold, and the papers in her hand. She unfolded the letter. The familiar slant of Arthur's handwriting, the way he looped his e's, brought a sudden, sharp ache to her chest. "My dearest Mabel," it began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and I can only pray that you have found this before the wolves have come to the door. Forgive my secrecy. I never trusted that man Croft, nor his bank. A man's savings should be in gold, in the earth, not in a ledger book on some clerk's desk. I took the loan from him many years ago, it is true, but I paid it off with the money from that good timber sale up on the North Ridge. I paid it to the head bank in Portland, so Croft wouldn't know. He is the kind of man who would lose the paperwork on purpose. I buried the deed and the receipt here, under our first tree, for safekeeping. I always meant to tell you. I always meant to do so many things." The letter went on, a confession of his financial fears, his shame at his inability to make the orchard flourish, and his deep, abiding love for her. He had saved the gold, coin by coin, over 30 years, a secret nest egg for her, for their old age. "The orchard was my dream, Mabel, and I fear it became your burden. But the land is good. The trees are strong. Perhaps in better hands it can still be the haven I always imagined. This gold is for you. To hire help, to buy what you need, to be free. It is all the security I could ever give you. It is yours, the land is yours. It was always yours. He had signed it, forever yours. Arthur." She read the letter twice, then a third time, the tears she had refused to shed for Mr. Croft now falling freely, soaking into the brittle paper. He had not been a fool. He had been a worrier, a secret keeper, a man who loved her so much he had planned for her survival from beyond the grave, in his own chaotic, unconventional way. The first act of rebuilding was not done with a hammer or a saw, but with a piece of paper. The next morning, Mabel dressed in her good Sunday dress, the dark gray wool she had worn to the funeral. She pinned her hair up neatly and placed the oilcloth-wrapped papers in her handbag. She did not walk to the bank. She walked down the lane, past her own property line, to a small, well-kept house with a porch full of geraniums. This was the home of Judge Elias Vance. He was 80 years old, retired for a decade, but his mind was still considered the sharpest legal instrument in the county. He had known her father, and he had always greeted Mabel with a gentle, old-fashioned courtesy. He met her at the door, leaning on a hickory cane. His eyes, though clouded with age, were sharp and inquisitive. "Mabel," he said, his voice a low rumble. Come in, come in." She sat in his parlor, a room that smelled of old books and pipe tobacco, and she laid the papers out on a small table between them. The deed, the paid receipt from the Portland Bank, and Mr. Croft's foreclosure notice. She did not show him the letter. That was for her alone. The judge put on a pair of spectacles and examined the documents in silence for a long time. He held the receipt up to the light from the window. He tapped the stamped seal with his fingernail. He read Croft's notice, his lips tightening into a thin, grim line. Finally, he took off his spectacles and looked at her. "Arthur paid it off," he said. "It was not a question." "Yes," Mabel replied. "Croft's bank in Lafayette was only the local agent for the loan," the judge explained, thinking aloud. "The actual note was held by the First Bank of Portland. When Arthur paid it there, they would have sent a release of lien to be filed here, at our county courthouse. It seems that release was never filed." He looked at her again. "Or it was misplaced. He did not need to say by whom. Silas Croft is a patient vulture, Mabel. He has been waiting for this land." He stood up slowly. "My son, Matthew. He's the county clerk. He's a good boy. You will go with him to the courthouse this morning." Matthew Vance arrived 20 minutes later, a younger, sturdier version of his father. The judge explained the situation in a few curt sentences. Matthew listened, his expression growing more serious with each word. He looked at Mabel with a newfound respect. "We can file a certified copy of this receipt as proof of payment and record the satisfaction of the mortgage today, Mrs. Dunn," he said. "It will become a matter of public record. Mr. Croft's claim will be null and void." The process at the courthouse was quiet and anticlimactic. Matthew led her to a large, dusty office lined with heavy ledger books. He made a careful copy of the receipt, stamped it with several official-looking seals, and had Mabel sign a simple affidavit. He then made an entry in a large, leather-bound book, his pen scratching across the page. It was done. The land was legally, indisputably hers. As they walked out into the daylight, Matthew turned to her. "My father was right," he said. "You've got grit, Mrs. Dunn." The news of Silas Croft's failed claim spread through the small town the way water seeps into dry ground, quickly and quietly. There was no public confrontation. Croft simply became a smaller man overnight. He no longer strode down the main street. He scurried. When he saw Mabel at the general store a week later, he turned his face away, suddenly fascinated by a display of horse liniment. His defeat was silent, administrative, and complete. The gold from the strongbox gave Mabel something she hadn't had in years: options. She did not spend it lavishly. She deposited a small portion of it in the bank in the next town over, and the rest she kept hidden in a new, safer place inside the house. Her first purchase was a set of new tools: a sharp pruning saw with a curved blade, a pair of geared loppers that would multiply the strength in her arms, and a fine-grained whetstone. The physical rebuilding of the orchard began 2 weeks later. A young farmer named Ben Carter, whose land bordered hers to the south, appeared at her door one morning, his hat in his hands. He was a man of about 30, with strong shoulders and calloused palms. "Mrs. Dunn," he said, "I heard what happened, and I heard you aim to work the orchard." "I do," Mabel said. "It's a big job for one person," he stated simply. "I've got a team and a disc plow. I could turn over the soil between the rows for you, help break up that sod. It'd be a day's work." Mabel knew this was an offer of help, but she also knew that men like Ben Carter had their own pride. "I can pay you for your time and your team," she said, and the relief in his face was visible. He was a neighbor, but he was not a charity case, and he respected that she saw that. For 2 days, the steady rhythm of Ben's horses and the churning of the plow filled the air. The hard, packed ground between the trees was broken open, revealing the dark, rich soil beneath. The work was the first breath the orchard had taken in years. While Ben worked, another neighbor appeared. Sarah Reed, a widow herself, walked over from her small homestead carrying a covered basket. Inside was a hot stew, a loaf of fresh bread, and a jar of her own pickled beets. She did not mention the bank or Mr. Croft. She talked about the weather and the poor price for eggs, and then she looked out at the trees. "That's a lot of pruning," she said. "My husband, he always said you prune in winter for growth and in summer for fruit." It was an offering of knowledge, a gift more valuable than stew. Community was not coalescing in declarations of friendship, but in these quiet, practical acts of shared work and accumulated wisdom. Mabel Dunn was no longer the poor widow on the edge of town. She was becoming a fixture, a landowner, a woman with a purpose. Over the next year, the orchard was slowly reborn. Mabel, armed with her new tools and Ben's occasional help, began the monumental task of pruning. She started in the cold, clear days of January, following the advice Sarah had given her. She learned to read the language of the branches. She cut away the deadwood, the crossing limbs that chafed against each other, and the spindly water sprouts that grew straight up, stealing the tree's energy. It was hard, aching work. Each cut was a decision. Each fallen branch felt like a small victory. By the time the first buds began to swell in March, the orchard had a new shape. It looked spare and skeletal, but it was a clean, strong skeleton. Light and air could now move freely between the branches. When spring arrived, the trees responded. The bloom was thicker and more vibrant than any she had seen in 20 years. For 2 weeks, the orchard was a sea of pale pink and white, buzzing with the sound of bees. Mabel became a part of the place. Her days fell into a rhythm dictated by the seasons and the needs of the trees. She cleared the irrigation ditches herself, her hands and knees covered in mud, until the water from the creek once again flowed in clear, straight lines between the rows. People in town knew her name now, and they said it with respect. "That's Mabel Dunn," they would whisper at the post office. She brought that old orchard back from the dead. The small rituals of community deepened. Sarah Reed came by every Thursday, and together they would work in the garden or mend clothes, talking about remedies for apple scab and the best way to store winter squash. Ben Carter would stop his wagon on the road and call out advice. "Looks like you'll need to thin the fruit on those pippins, Mrs. Dunn, or the branches will break." The unwanted thing, the symbol of her husband's failure, was transforming. It was becoming a living, breathing place. It was not a grand estate, but it was functional. It was respected, and it was hers. That autumn the harvest came. It was not a bumper crop, but it was a real crop. The apples were large and well-formed, their skins clean and bright. Ben helped her with the picking, and Sarah showed her how to sort and pack them into the old crates, which Mabel had painstakingly repaired. She sold half the crop to the general store and kept the other half, canning applesauce, making apple butter, and drying rings of apples on long strings in her kitchen until the whole house was filled with their sweet, sharp perfume. The orchard was no longer a burden. It was her livelihood, her refuge, her proof. It was home. It was autumn again, a year to the day since she had walked the rows, preparing to say goodbye. Mabel stood in the same spot at the back of the property, beside the old Newtown pippin tree they called Adam. The air was crisp and smelled of ripe apples and wood smoke from a distant chimney. The trees, now pruned into open, graceful shapes, were heavy with fruit. The afternoon sun slanted through the branches, casting long shadows across the neatly tilled soil. The orchard was quiet, orderly, and productive. It was beautiful. She reached into her apron pocket, her fingers closing around the familiar shape of the small, carved bird. She pulled it out and held it in her palm. The cherry wood, polished, smooth by 56 years of her touch, glowed a warm, deep red in the sunlight. Her father had given her this bird, a symbol of quiet competence, of work done well for its own sake. He had taught her to see the true grain of things, to value what was solid and real beneath a rough exterior. Arthur, her dreamer, had given her this land. He had not known how to tame it, but he had loved it, and in his own secret, fearful way, he had ensured it would remain hers. He had left her the means, hidden in the earth, a final, desperate act of love and provision. And the community, people like Elias and Matthew, Ben and Sarah, had helped her rebuild. They had offered their knowledge, their labor, their quiet respect, not out of pity, but in recognition of her own steady strength. Silas Croft and his administrative cruelty felt like a story from another lifetime. He had seen only a failed asset and a helpless woman. He had never seen the good soil, the strong roots, or the carpenter's daughter who knew how to build. Mabel looked at the small bird in her hand, then at the sturdy, fruit-laden branch beside her. Gently, she placed the wren on the branch, nestling it between two perfect yellow-green apples. It sat there, its head cocked, a small, perfect thing of the past, resting securely in the bounty of the present. Mabel Dunn was 67 years old. A year ago, she had been a widow left with a failed orchard and a foreclosure notice. It was all her husband had left her, and it was the best thing he ever could have given her. Thank you for joining us for Mabel's story. Sometimes the greatest treasures are not found in a grand discovery, but are cultivated through patience, hard work, and the quiet faith of a community. If her story touched your heart, please consider sharing it with someone who might need it. And we'd love to leave you with a question. What hidden value might be waiting in the things you've overlooked in your own life?